Who are you trying to save, studying anatomy at 2 in the morning down in my kitchen?" The voice was deep, rough with age and authority, and it made Lena Moreno freeze where she sat. Her pencil was still pressed against the scrap of grocery paper she had been using, a paper stained with oil and flour that now carried the fragile lines of the human lung. A single bulb above her buzzed and flickered, casting more shadow than light across the vast marble kitchen. She turned slowly, and there in the doorway stood Mr. Elliot Langford. He was the master of the house, a man whose name appeared in newspapers, whose signature shifted markets, a man whispered about in city boardrooms. He was tall and lean, silver hair combed back with impatient precision. His robe draped around him like armor, and his eyes were sharp enough to cut through pretense. Lena's heart pounded in her chest. She had always known this night might come. The Langford estate had rules, unspoken but ironclad. Servants did not use the kitchen after hours. Servants certainly did not scatter papers across the table like professors in a lecture hall. And above all, servants did not trespass into the realms of science and medicine, worlds that belonged to another class entirely. Her voice trembled as she tried to answer. I was just... Elliot's gaze fell to the paper on the table. His lips curved in something between a frown and a smirk. Alveoli. You have written about alveoli. Do you even know what that means? She swallowed, but her answer came steady. They are the tiny sacs in the lungs, sir, where oxygen passes into the blood and carbon dioxide leaves. They look like clusters of grapes under a microscope. For a moment, the mansion seemed utterly still. Even the clock on the far wall seemed to hesitate between ticks. Elliot stepped closer, his bare feet silent against the cold marble. He bent over the paper, staring at her careful pencil lines, a drawing crude in materials but precise in detail. Bronchi branching into bronchioles, ending in small balloon-like sacs. Where did you learn that? His voice was low, but each word carried weight. Who gave you permission to study like this? Her breath caught. She knew what he expected. Apology, confession, and then dismissal. But something inside her refused to hide. She met his eyes, timid yet stubborn, and said, "No one gave me permission, sir." But I had to know. Elliot folded his arms across his chest, studying her as one might study a puzzle. Had to know what? And why would a 19-year-old maid be awake at this hour drawing lungs on the back of butcher paper? The words came spilling out of her before she could stop them. Because I need to understand why my little brother cannot breathe at night. Why he coughs until he turns blue. Because every doctor says it is expensive, that without insurance he cannot have the medicines. Because if I do not learn, no one will explain to me what is happening inside him. Her voice cracked, but her eyes did not fall away. Elliot Langford had faced senators, rivals, men who gambled billions without blinking. Few had ever spoken to him with such trembling honesty. He looked again at the paper. Beneath the sketch of the alveoli, she had written a formula in block letters. C6H12O6 plus 6O2 becomes 6CO2 plus 6H2O plus energy. His eyebrow arched. That is cellular respiration. Yes, sir. Lena's voice steadied. It is how sugar and oxygen become energy in our cells. If the lungs cannot provide oxygen, the whole equation fails. My brother's energy fails. The words hung in the kitchen, heavier than the air itself. The Langford kitchen at night was a kingdom of polished granite counters and stainless steel appliances, silent and gleaming. To Lena, it was not a kitchen, but a sanctuary. When the household slept, she crept down with scavenged scraps of paper and stubby pencils taken from delivery boxes. She had no notebooks. Flour sacks became her chalkboards. Grocery paper became her lecture sheets. In the corner of the table rested a faded anatomy book with a torn spine. Human Anatomy 7th edition, rescued from a trash heap near the community college. The pages were water-stained, the diagrams blurred, but she had traced them until her fingers darkened with graphite. Upstairs, her world was trays, linens, and silence. Downstairs, it was Latin words whispered like prayers, bronchioles, alveoli, pleura. Now the master of the house stood in the middle of her secret classroom. Elliot pulled out a chair and sat across from her. The scrape of wood against stone echoed in the cavernous room. His eyes did not leave hers. "You are supposed to clean and serve, not play doctor." "I know, sir." "And yet here you are, writing about respiration as if you were in medical school." "I just try to learn." "Why not ask a real physician? You work in a house where doctors dine at every gala." Her hands tightened around the pencil. "They do not see me, sir. They do not even remember my name." The silence returned, as heavy as the hush before thunder. Elliot tapped the formula with one long finger. "Explain this to me. Imagine I am your brother. What does it mean?" She inhaled shakily, then began, her words slow and deliberate. "Every bite of bread or fruit we eat turns into sugar, glucose. The blood carries it to each cell. But sugar alone is useless without oxygen. That is what the lungs provide. Oxygen slips through the alveoli into the blood. In the cell, sugar meets oxygen. Together they burn, not with fire, but with a quiet flame that gives us the energy to breathe, to walk, to think. That energy is called ATP. But when my brother's lungs are clogged, oxygen cannot cross. The flame flickers. He grows weak. That is why I have to know." Elliot said nothing, but his posture softened almost imperceptibly. For the first time in many years, he was listening not as master of the house, but as a man confronted with truth. He studied her in the dim light. She was thin, her apron stained, hair tied back hastily. But her eyes, dark and resolute, burned brighter than the chandeliers upstairs. "Your brother," he said at last, "How old is he?" 6. "And what do the doctors call his condition?" She hesitated before answering. "Cystic fibrosis. I read it once in a pamphlet. It means the mucus in his lungs is too thick. It clogs the small airways. He needs medicines, machines, treatments we cannot afford. So I read. I watch old videos online. I copy diagrams. Maybe one day I can help him." Her words held no arrogance, only the humility of someone praying for a life not her own. Something flickered across Elliot's stern features, a memory he thought long buried. Many years ago, his younger brother had drowned in a lake while Elliot was powerless to save him. He remembered the gasps, the desperate struggle for air, the helplessness that had marked him for life. He had not thought of that day in decades, until this trembling maid spoke of her own brother's failing breath. He cleared his throat harshly. "You risk your job, your future, all for some midnight sketches." "Yes," Lena answered simply, "if that is what it takes." He leaned back, unsettled by her resolve. By all rights, he should have dismissed her on the spot. That was how order was kept. But the command refused to form. Instead, he asked, "And if you fail? If your studies come to nothing and your brother—" He did not finish the thought. Lena lowered her eyes to her sketches. "Then at least I will have tried. At least he will know his sister did not close her eyes while he struggled for air." The clock struck 2:30. The mansion remained still. Elliot rose slowly, his robe brushing the marble. He regarded her with an expression she could not name, somewhere between sternness and reluctant respect. "Clean this up before morning," he said gruffly. "Yes, sir." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Tell me one thing before I go. Why lungs?" "Why not the heart or the brain or any other noble organ?" Her answer came without hesitation. Because the lungs are where life first meets the world. A child's first cry, an old man's last sigh. Every breath is borrowed time. I cannot let my brother's time run out. The words lingered in the kitchen like a quiet benediction. Elliot did not reply. He walked away silently, his footsteps fading down the long corridor. For the first time in many years, he felt a question gnawing at him, not about wealth or power, but about the stubborn spark of hope he had just witnessed in a girl who owned nothing. Alone again, Lena gathered her papers with trembling hands. Her future was uncertain. Tomorrow she might be dismissed. But tonight she had spoken her truth aloud. Tonight, the flame of her brother's breath felt a little stronger. The sound haunted her, even in the grand silence of the Langford mansion. It was not the clinking of crystal glasses or the sweep of servants' shoes on polished floors. It was the sound of her brother Lucas struggling for air, a wheeze that rose and fell like an old instrument in disrepair, each breath a battle. Whenever Lena closed her eyes, she was back in the small rented room where he lay, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with fear as if the simple act of breathing might abandon him at any moment. That sound drove her through sleepless nights, through stolen hours with anatomy books and scraps of paper, through the dangerous defiance of studying when she should have been invisible. After their first conversation in the kitchen, Lena expected Elliot Langford to dismiss her without ceremony. Instead, days passed in uneasy quiet. He made no announcement, gave no command. She went about her duties as before, moving silently through the mansion, folding linens, serving tea, arranging trays. But something had shifted. Sometimes she felt his eyes on her, as if the old man were weighing a question he had not yet chosen to ask. It came one morning when the household bustled with its usual rhythm. The servants laid out breakfast in the vast dining hall, a room that seemed built for kings rather than a single aging man. Sunlight fell through high windows onto polished wood and silver cutlery. Elliot sat at the head of the table, a solitary figure with his newspaper and black coffee. As Lena cleared away a platter, his voice cut through the stillness. "Tell me again about your brother." "The one with the wheezing breath." The words stopped her in her tracks. She turned, startled, unsure if she had heard correctly. His eyes were on her, sharp and unblinking. "Lucas," she said quietly. "He is 6 years old. He has cystic fibrosis. That is what the doctors called it." "Explain it," he said. His tone was not cruel but commanding. Slowly. Her hands tightened on the tray she carried, but she answered. "Inside the lungs there is mucus. Normally it is thin, almost like water. It helps trap dust and germs so the body can clear them out. But in cystic fibrosis, the mucus is thick and sticky, like glue. It clogs the small airways, the bronchioles. Air struggles to pass. Bacteria grow. The child coughs and coughs, but the passages close more and more. The lungs become scarred. Breathing becomes harder each day." Elliot sipped his coffee, face unreadable. "And what is the treatment?" Her voice grew smaller. "There are medicines. One is called pulmozyme. It breaks down the mucus. There are vibrating vests, machines that shake the chest so the mucus can come loose. There are inhaled antibiotics to fight infection. But all of it costs more than I can ever hope to earn. Without insurance, the hospitals will not even see us." He set down his cup with deliberate care. "So instead, you sketch lungs on paper and watch stolen videos in the night." She nodded, shame creeping into her chest, though she would not deny it. "I try to learn. At least if I know what is happening, I will not be blind while he suffers. Even if I cannot heal him, I can be present. I can tell him what is happening inside him. That matters to him. It matters to me." Elliot looked at her a long while, then returned to his newspaper as if nothing had been said. but Lena felt his silence pressing heavier than any scolding might have. That evening, when her work was done, she traveled across town by bus to the neighborhood she still called home. The houses were low and faded, their paint peeling under the desert sun. She walked up the cracked steps of a building that smelled faintly of dust and old cooking oil. Inside, in a room hardly bigger than a closet, Lucas lay curled beneath a threadbare blanket. The air was thick with the sound of his breathing. "Hi, hermanita," he whispered when he saw her, using the Spanish word for little sister, though she was older. It was his private joke. "Hi, viejo," she replied softly, calling him old man. His thin lips curled in a grin before a violent cough shook him. She sat on the bed, steadying him with one hand on his back. She could feel the vibration under his ribs, the heavy presence of mucus refusing to release. She closed her eyes for a moment, picturing what she had studied. Tiny bronchioles clogged with thick secretions, alveoli starved of air, oxygen trapped from crossing into the blood. It was no longer just a diagram. It was here, living inside her brother. She pulled out the folded sheets she always carried. Rough sketches of lungs, arrows marking the movement of air. Lucas traced the lines with his finger, his eyes tired but curious. "See, Lucas?" she whispered. "When air goes in, it should reach these little sacs. The alveoli. That is where oxygen enters the blood. But the mucus blocks the way. That is why it feels like you are breathing through a straw. That is why it is so hard. But I am learning. One day, I will find a way to make it easier for you." Lucas nodded, his eyelids heavy. He trusted her completely. To him, she was not a servant in a stranger's house. She was the only scientist who cared about him, the only doctor who would never turn him away. Hours later, Lena returned to the mansion with exhaustion in her bones and the sound of her brother's wheeze still in her ears. To her surprise, Elliot Langford was waiting near the servants' hall. He rarely appeared there, yet tonight his figure loomed in the dim corridor. "Did you see him?" he asked quietly. She stiffened. "Yes, sir." "And?" Her throat tightened. "He is weaker. The coughing is worse. Some nights I fear he will not survive until morning." For a long moment, Elliot said nothing. His hands were clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the walls. At last he spoke. "What would you do if you had the means?" "The means? Money? Access? Authority? If you had all of it, what then?" The answer leapt to her lips without thought. "I would buy the medicines. I would buy the vest that helps shake the mucus loose. I would take him to doctors who do not look away. And I would learn everything I could, so that no one could tell me his life is not worth saving." Her voice did not shake this time. Elliot turned his head, his eyes catching hers for a brief moment. In them, she thought she saw something she could not name, something half hidden behind the steel of his expression. He looked away quickly, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. "You speak as though life itself were something to be defended with knowledge and will." "It is, sir," Lena replied. At least for me. That night, Elliot Langford lay awake in his vast bed, the curtains drawn against the city lights. The mansion was silent, but he could not rest. He thought of his own younger brother, the one who had drowned decades ago, gasping for air while Elliot watched powerless from the shore. He thought of Lucas, a boy of 6, fighting for every breath in a room far too small. And he thought of the girl who worked under his roof, a girl who studied with nothing but scraps and determination, because to her, knowledge was not ambition, but survival. He drew in a long breath, effortless, abundant, then let it go. For the first time in many years, he wondered what it would mean to fight for each inhalation. He wondered what it might cost to keep a single child alive. And somewhere in the shadows of the mansion, the words of Lena Moreno echoed in his mind. Every breath is borrowed time. The old stairwell to the storage rooms was narrow and poorly lit, a place the other servants avoided except when they needed to fetch an extra tray or a box of glassware. To Lena, it was the safest corner of the mansion. The air smelled faintly of flour and cold iron. Pipes whispered along the ceiling. In that dim hush, she could nestle her notes beside the crates, spread her scavenged papers across a wooden crate, and let her thoughts travel into the hidden hallways of the human chest. She learned the rhythm of the house so well that she could move without waking it. When the clock in the front hall chimed 1 in the morning, the gardeners were long asleep. The chauffeur had gone to his room over the garage, and the night guard had taken his second cup of coffee. Lena eased down the steps, pressed her palm against the damp wall, and took her place on an overturned pail that had become her chair. She lifted the pencil she kept in the fold of her apron and began to draw the bronchial tree again, each branch a thin line reaching into emptiness. She drew slowly, speaking to herself in a whisper. Trachea, main bronchi, lobar bronchi, segmental bronchi, smaller bronchi, bronchioles, terminal bronchioles. At the end, the alveoli. She sketched the blood vessels that looped around those tiny sacs, blue turning to red, deoxygenated turning to oxygenated, though the colors were only in her mind. The letters on the paper were plain and careful. She had learned to avoid flourish. She wrote small notes beneath the lines, thin mucus moved by tiny hair-like cilia. Cilia sweep upward toward the throat. This is called the mucociliary escalator. If it fails, mucus sits and germs grow. From the upper room came a faint thud of pipes cooling. Lena paused to listen. When the mansion settled again, she went on. She had taped a broken mirror to the wall and used it to practice saying words with confidence. Surfactant. That is a slippery substance made inside the small sacs by cells called type 2 cells. It keeps the sacs from collapsing. Imagine a cluster of soap bubbles. The tiniest bubble wants to collapse first. Surfactant makes the surface less tense, so the little ones stay open. Without it, a child must use more force to keep the sacs open with each breath. My brother fights that battle every night. She pictured Lucas, drew a small rectangle in the corner and wrote his name beside it, then stopped herself. No more names on these papers. If someone found them, better they be only diagrams and plain words. She pulled out a length of thread and a few drinking straws she had collected from a broken box in the pantry. She fitted the straws together into a branching model and tied the thread across the end of one straw. When she blew gently, the thread lifted. When she smeared a trace of oil on the thread, it lifted more easily. She scribbled a note to herself. Less tension. Easier opening. Then she wrote the sentence she wanted to remember by heart. Easier opening means less work for the child. She did not hear Elliot at first. The sound he made was only the faint shift of a shoe on wood. When she looked up, he was there, a tall shadow at the base of the steps. His shoulder turned slightly as if he had been listening for a long time. He wore no robe tonight. A dark sweater made him seem thinner, and the light from a bulb above his head caught the hard planes of his face. "You moved your classroom," he said. Lena rose so fast that her chair tipped. "I am sorry, sir. I did not mean to use—" He lifted his hand. "Enough apology. Show me what you were doing with the straws." She swallowed and held out the little branching model. "It looks foolish," she said, "but it helps me explain something to myself. If the tiny sacs are sticky, they do not open easily. If there is enough surfactant, the surface of the sac is more slippery and it opens with less force. I tried to make a small proof I could understand." To her surprise, Elliot drew closer and took the bundle of straws carefully, as if it were glass. He turned it over in his long fingers, then pointed to the notes on the paper. "You wrote about the cilia and the escalator," he said. I have not heard those words since I tried to read a chapter about lungs many years ago and gave up by page 5. Lena could not tell if he mocked her or himself. She kept her voice even. The lungs clean themselves from the inside, sir. Little hairs move in waves and push the mucus upward, and we swallow it without knowing. But if the mucus is too thick, the escalator stalls, infection takes root. And you think you can rescue this escalator with a pencil and some thread? Elliot said. The words were dry, but his eyes were not unkind. No, she said. But I can learn what the escalator needs in order to work. Thin mucus, open airways, gentle coughing that does not bruise the chest, warm, humid air. Sometimes posture helps, gravity pulling the mucus from the deeper places toward the larger ones where it can be cleared. They call it chest physiotherapy. A patient lies a certain way and someone claps gently on the back or the side of the chest, and the trapped mucus loosens. If I do it wrong, I hurt him. If I do it right, I help. She looked down, embarrassed by how plain the words sounded in this cold room. When she raised her eyes, Elliot was studying the largest sheet of paper, the one she had taped along the wall. It held a map of the lungs divided into territories. Right upper lobe, right middle lobe, right lower lobe, left upper lobe, left lower lobe. Each had lines within its segments, as if the lungs were a city made of neighborhoods. "What is this?" he asked. "Why draw it so carefully?" "These are the segments," she said. "Surgeons and radiologists talk about them as if they were city blocks. If someone tells me a blockage is in the posterior segment of the right lower lobe, I can picture where the air is not flowing. I can position a child so gravity helps that area drain. I drew the blood vessels, too. If a vessel is blocked, the air and the blood no longer meet in the same place, and the body wastes breath or it wastes blood. That mismatch has a name, but you do not need the name to feel it. You hear it when the breath is shallow and useless." Elliot lifted his head as if something in her patient explanation had touched an old bruise. He set the straw model down and walked along the wall, reading her careful notes under his breath. He stopped at one line written larger than the rest. "Oxygen rides on hemoglobin like a passenger in a carriage. The carriage lets go when the tissues are cold or warm or acidic in different ways." She had tried to write the science without symbols, only in images she could say aloud to a child. He glanced back at her. "Where did you learn to put this into such simple words?" "From trying to say it to Lucas," she said. "If I can say it in plain words, it means I understand a part of it. If I cannot, then I am only reciting." He set his palm on the rough wood of a shelf and stood very still. The bulbs hummed. The pipes knocked quietly. Somewhere overhead a clock ticked and paused and ticked again. The mansion, which often felt like a machine that ran itself, now seemed to be listening with them. "You speak as if you have listened at bedsides," he said. "I have listened at one," she answered. "Most nights when I can. His breathing tells me more than any chart. When the wheeze grows higher, the airways are tighter. When it loosens, the air is getting through. When there is no sound at all, that is the worst. Silence can mean no air is moving. That is when I sit up all night." Elliot turned, and for a second she saw not a master of the house but a man facing an old memory. He breathed in, deep and even, then let the breath go. "Show me how you listen," he said. She pulled from a drawer a stethoscope with a cracked tube, something she had found at a yard sale and cleaned for hours. The rubber was old, the metal scratched. It was not proper equipment for any professional, but in her hands it felt precious. She pressed the earpieces into his hands. "On me?" he asked, startled. "If you want to hear how normal sounds," she said gently. "Put it on your own chest first, along the upper chest, then the sides, then the back. Breathe in through your nose, out through your mouth. Slow and steady." He hesitated, then rested the round piece against his sweater, moved it as she directed, and breathed. His face shifted, the first hint of wonder she had seen there. "It sounds like wind in a grove of trees," he said. "That is a good sound," she said. "It is called vesicular, but the word does not matter. The wind image matters. In Lucas, sometimes the wind is thin, sometimes it squeals, sometimes there is a crackle like paper. That crackle means fluid or secretions, and I have to sit him up and help him cough." She took the stethoscope back, held it up for a moment as if asking forgiveness for the rust, then set it carefully on the shelf. Elliot looked again at the paper. At the bottom of one sheet she had written a list, like a promise. Wash hands, warm the air, sit him upright, encourage slow breaths, gentle clapping over the ribs, drink water or a warm broth, rest, then repeat. No pride, no panic, just steady work. Elliot read the list twice, his lips moving without sound. Then he asked a question that surprised them both. "Why do you know more than a student I once met who was in the 3rd year of medical school?" Lena blinked. "I do not know more, sir. I only know one thing very deeply, because I have to. A student in school must know 100 things for exams. I have only one patient. My brother. Everything I learn, I measure against his breath. If it does not help, I forget it. If it helps, I keep it and polish it until I can say it in the dark." He stood straighter at that. For a moment he looked like a younger man, drawn tight around a decision. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small key. He turned it over on his palm as if considering a wager, then closed his hand and put it back. Not yet. Instead, he walked to the steps and called up into the kitchen. "Mrs. Keene." The housekeeper was quick on her feet even at this hour. Her shoes clicked on the floor above, then on the steps. She was a tall woman with careful hair and the expression of someone who believed order itself might fall if she blinked. Her eyes went to Lena's papers, and her mouth thinned. "Sir," she said, "I have told the staff that the storage rooms are not for personal use." Elliot did not look away from the wall of drawings. "Mrs. Keene," he said, "as of tonight this room is permitted for study after hours by this employee alone. If anyone moves these papers, they answer to me." The housekeeper's eyes flashed. "With respect, sir, if this becomes known, there will be talk. We must keep standards. One does not want the servants playing doctor under the kitchen." Lena's stomach fell. She gathered her notes with shaking hands, ready to accept blame. Elliot lifted one finger and the room stilled. "Standards," he said softly. "Yes. Let us keep them. Here is the first. No one will mock an honest effort to learn. Here is the second. No tool is to be thrown away if it serves. These papers serve. They stay." He turned then, and his gaze softened almost imperceptibly when it fell on Lena. "And here is the third. We do not step on a spark because it is small." Mrs. Keene pressed her lips together. "Very well, sir," she said. "But there will be questions from the staff." "Send them to me," he said. She inclined her head and left, the click of her heels fading up the stairs. When they were alone again, Lena folded her arms across her chest, half to steady herself, half to keep from crying. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely more than breath. "Do not thank me," he answered. "I have not decided anything worth thanks." He gestured to the wall. "You said earlier that names do not matter as much as images. I remember a name, though, the person who wrote the book I once tried to read. He drew this tree of air. He said the lungs are like a garden turned inside out, air moving where roots would be. Does that picture help you?" "It does," she said. "The garden must be watered and kept clear. Weeds choke it. If the gardener is careful, small things grow where they should. If the gardener is careless, everything withers." I am trying to be a gardener for one boy. Elliot nodded once, slowly. Then he did a small, unexpected thing. He slid his sweater sleeve back and pressed his own hand to the wall near her drawings, as if taking an oath. He looked a little startled at himself, then let his hand drop. "Tomorrow evening there will be a gathering here," he said. "A few guests, some of them are physicians. You will work the kitchen as usual, no more and no less, but keep your ears open. Listen to how they speak when they think no one is listening. It may teach you as much as your book." She understood that this was both permission and warning. "I will listen," she said. He took a step up the stairs, then paused. "If someone had asked me yesterday what a breath is worth, I would have given an answer based on money. Today I find I do not know how to answer. Perhaps I will ask you again in a week." She watched him climb. When he was gone, she sank back onto the pail and sat in the warm circle of the bulb. The pipes hummed. The straw tree lay quiet on the shelf. She looked at her notes and added one last line for the night. "The airway is not a pipe only. It is a living path that can be coached to open." Then she dated the page and put the pencil down. Before she left, she gathered her papers and stacked them in careful order, not only because she feared someone might touch them, but because she had learned that order kept fear at bay. She placed the stethoscope atop the stack like a small metal heart and turned off the light. On the stairs, she paused and drew one breath in and one breath out, slow and deliberate, as if to honor the garden inside her chest. She imagined Lucas doing the same somewhere across town. In that shared breath, the distance between the mansion and the small rented room seemed, for a moment, to vanish. Upstairs, the kitchen slept. Tomorrow the crystal would shine, and the silver would ring, and guests would fill the halls with polite laughter. Lena would move among them unseen, carrying trays and listening as if her whole life depended on it. In a way, it did. And down below, under the kitchen, her sketches waited in the quiet, patient as seeds under snow. The gala began with the sound of crystal and laughter. The Langford mansion was dressed in light, chandeliers throwing brilliance across gowns and black suits. Silver trays floated through the air on the arms of servants, carrying wine and delicacies prepared in kitchens that glowed like forges. Elliot Langford moved among his guests with the grace of long habit, nodding here, answering there, his tall figure wrapped in command. Lena moved in silence through the hall, her tray steady, her eyes lowered as she had been taught. Yet her ears were open, her mind absorbing words spoken carelessly by physicians and scholars who believed no servant could follow their talk. She heard discussions of stem cell therapy, whispers of a new drug trial in Boston, arguments about the ethics of gene editing. She caught phrases and tucked them into memory, seeds she would water later in her hidden room. The evening was a performance, polished and predictable until a sudden cry cracked the air. At the long table near the center of the hall, a guest had slumped sideways, a glass shattered against the floor. His hand clawed at his throat, his face reddening, then paling. A woman screamed, chairs scraped, the music stumbled and stopped. Someone shouted, "He cannot breathe!" For a moment, confusion reigned. Guests leapt back, voices clashed, hands fluttered helplessly. Two physicians rose from their seats, but their faces were tight with shock. One barked for an ambulance. Another searched his pockets, muttering about his missing bag. Lena's tray fell with a crash, food scattering across the carpet. She was already moving. Her hands shook, but her mind was steady, clearer than ever before. She dropped to her knees beside the man. His lips were swelling, his eyes bulging, his breaths short and high like a whistle through a reed. "Allergies. Epinephrine," she whispered. Her voice was too soft for the crowd, but Elliot heard. He was suddenly beside her, his face grim, his voice ringing above the panic. "What do you need?" a pen or a kit?" "Any first aid box," she answered. The head butler rushed forward with the estate's emergency case. Lena tore it open, fingers searching with desperate speed until they closed around the injector. She pressed the device firmly against the man's thigh and counted aloud. 1, 2, 3. The man jerked, then gasped. She lifted his chin, tilted his head back to open the airway, and whispered, "Breathe. Please breathe." A wheeze rattled in his chest, then a gasp of air broke through. His chest lifted. His lips, though still swollen, darkened less. His wife clutched his hand, tears spilling down her cheeks. The physicians pushed forward now, taking over, their commands sharp, their hands brisk. Lena withdrew, her palms smeared with sweat, her knees wet from the spilled drink on the carpet. She stood against the wall, trembling, as voices rose and guests pressed close, whispering about the maid who had leapt forward when doctors froze. Elliot's gaze cut across the room and silenced them. His brother, the very man Lena had just saved, was being steadied in a chair, his breath shaky but present. Elliot's voice was iron. "This young woman saved his life. Without her, we would be waiting for an ambulance to arrive too late." The crowd murmured. Reporters, always hovering at the edges of such gatherings, began to scribble. Cameras clicked. The music did not return. The night was no longer a gala, but a story. And the story centered on the servant girl with trembling hands and knowledge no one expected her to hold. When the guests left and the hall fell silent, Elliot found her in the corridor outside the kitchen. She was pale, gripping the edge of a counter as if to steady herself. "You did not hesitate," he said. "I could not," she whispered. "You gave him what he needed." Her eyes filled. "I am not allowed, sir. I have no right." Elliot's voice softened, though his eyes remained fierce. "Tonight you had every right. Remember that." But even as he spoke, Lena knew the night would not end there. The world beyond the mansion would not let a servant save a life without asking questions. The questions came swiftly. By morning, the story had already reached the newspapers. Maid saves man at Langford Gala. Some papers called her a heroine. Others hinted at recklessness. The photograph showed her kneeling beside the guest, her hands steady on the injector, her face caught in an expression of desperate calm. By noon, the storm had shifted. Physicians interviewed by reporters declared that her actions were irresponsible, dangerous, possibly illegal. Without a license, she had no authority to touch a patient. What if she had given the wrong drug? What if she had killed him? Elliot called a press gathering in the marble foyer of his house. Reporters filled the space, their cameras flashing, their pens scratching furiously. He stood tall on the steps, Lena behind him, her eyes lowered, her apron plain among the dark suits. One reporter asked, "Mr. Langford, do you approve of an untrained servant taking medical action in your own home?" Elliot's voice cut through the din. "I do more than approve. I am grateful. That man who nearly died is my brother. He lives tonight because this young woman recognized anaphylaxis faster than any of you and gave the injection that saved his breath." A murmur swept the crowd. "But she has no degree," another voice challenged. Elliot's eyes flashed. "A degree does not save a life. Knowledge, courage, and presence save a life. Do not mistake the paper for the act." The words rang like a gavel. For a moment, the reporters were stunned into silence. Then the questions poured again, faster, sharper, about liability, about law, about precedent. Behind him, Lena whispered, "Please, do not defend me like this." He turned slightly, his voice low enough for her alone. "You saved my brother. The world may not forgive that easily, but I will not let them tear you down for it." In the days that followed, opinion split. Some praised her bravery. Others condemned her interference. Medical associations issued statements warning against unlicensed individuals practicing medicine. Elliot called her to his study, a room lined with dark shelves and heavy books, where sunlight filtered through high windows in narrow beams. He gestured for her to sit. "You have a gift," he said. "You proved it not only in the kitchen, not only in your drawings, but in the moment when a life depended on you." She shook her head. "It was only one act. One act can be enough," he replied. "Listen to me. I will sponsor you. I will pay for medical school, for the best education money can buy. You will become what you already are in spirit, a physician." Her throat tightened. She had dreamed of that word, but now she shook her head. "I cannot, sir." "Why not?" Her eyes filled as she whispered, "Because Lucas is still sick. Every hour I spend in a lecture hall is an hour he spends gasping alone. I cannot leave him for years of study while his time runs out." Elliot leaned back in his chair, struck by the quiet steel in her voice. He had expected gratitude, perhaps tears of relief. Instead, he heard refusal born not of fear, but of love. "You will burn yourself away," he said. "Better I burn," she answered, "than let him fade in silence for me." The study fell silent. The great clock ticked. Dust drifted in the shafts of light. Elliot looked at her and saw again what he had seen in the kitchen that first night. Not ambition, not rebellion, but devotion fierce enough to defy the world. And in that silence, he understood something he had forgotten long ago. That sometimes the purest knowledge does not come from degrees or institutions. It comes from love that refuses to surrender, even when the world calls it impossible. The coughs began one evening as the desert air grew cool. Lucas had always coughed, but this time Lena knew something was different. The sound came deeper, a heavy rattle that shook his whole body. His lips paled, his eyes glazed, and when she pressed her hand to his chest, she felt the uneven rise and fall as if one side of his lungs fought while the other lagged behind. She sat through the night counting his breaths, whispering encouragement, rubbing his back to loosen what little mucus she could. At dawn, with the light spilling faintly across the cracked walls of their small room, his breathing faltered into long pauses that made her own heart stop in fear. She wrapped him in the only clean blanket they had and carried him outside. A neighbor drove them to the small hospital in New Mexico, a building faded by sun, its walls lined with plastic chairs. Lena stood in line at the reception desk, Lucas weak in her arms, his head against her shoulder. The nurse glanced at the boy, then at the screen in front of her. "Do you have insurance?" "No," Lena answered. The nurse shook her head. "Without records, without proof of coverage, we cannot admit him." "He cannot breathe," Lena pleaded. "Please." The nurse's expression hardened, practiced and polite. "We have protocols. There are clinics for the uninsured." She handed Lena a folded brochure as if it were a cure. Elliot Langford arrived minutes later, his car pulling to the curb, his driver pale with worry. Elliot stepped out, his silver hair disheveled, his eyes sharp with anger. He took one look at the boy gasping in Lena's arms and said in a voice that filled the waiting room, "If you turn this child away, you answer to me." The staff stirred uneasily. Elliot's name opened doors, but even power has limits in the face of policies written in steel. The doctors muttered about liability, about rules, about their hands being tied. Elliot's jaw clenched, his voice a low growl. "Then we leave." They drove across town to a small private clinic Elliot knew, hidden behind plain walls, its sign worn by years of sun. Inside, a single physician with tired eyes agreed to see the boy. Lena laid Lucas on the table, her hands steady, though her chest shook with fear. The doctor placed an oxygen mask over his face, attached a monitor that blinked with numbers Lena recognized. Pulse, saturation, respiratory rate. The oxygen saturation dropped into the 70s, a dangerous valley. The doctor hesitated, glancing at Elliot, then at Lena. His tone was cautious. He needs aggressive clearance, nebulizers, chest physiotherapy, possibly intubation. But I do not know if he will tolerate it. Lena stepped forward. Let me help. The doctor frowned. You are not trained. I know, she said. But I have practiced. I know the rhythms. If you guide me, I can do it. Before the doctor could answer, Elliot spoke quietly. Watch her. That is all I ask. Watch her and tell me if she is wrong. The physician looked uncertain, but at that moment, Lucas coughed weakly, the sound fading into silence that froze the room. The doctor nodded once. All right. Lena lifted her brother's frail chest in her hands, positioning him slightly forward, letting gravity assist. She tapped rhythmically along his back, gentle but firm, the way she had practiced night after night in the shadows of the mansion basement. She whispered to him as she worked, Breathe for me, Lucas, just one more. In through the nose, out through the mouth. That is it. The monitor beeped faintly. The numbers wavered, then held. Oxygen crept upward, slowly, painfully. The doctor leaned close, watching. Elliot stood in the corner, his fists clenched, his eyes fixed on the boy's fragile chest. And then, with a sudden shudder, Lucas coughed hard, and a mass of thick mucus expelled from his throat. His chest heaved, the sound of air rushing in more freely. Lena held him, tears streaming down her face. The doctor's shoulders sagged with relief. He will need constant care, the physician said. This is not the end. But you bought him time. Elliot's voice was hoarse when he spoke. Time is all any of us ever buy. The doctor glanced at Elliot, then at Lena, his eyes troubled. Who taught you this? No one, Lena said softly. I only listened. Later that evening, when Lucas slept under a clean sheet with the oxygen mask humming beside him, Elliot stepped outside into the warm night. He pulled a phone from his pocket and dialed a number known only to a few. Within hours, a man arrived at the clinic, a professor from Harvard Medical School, a physician Elliot had trusted once in another life. The professor watched Lena work with her brother and said nothing. He only wrote notes quietly in the margin of a pad, his eyes sharp, as if he had seen something rare. And Lena, though exhausted, kept her vigil, the battle fought in silence, unseen by the world, her only reward, the rise and fall of her brother's chest. The next morning, the crisis deepened. Lucas's fever climbed, his lips bluish despite the oxygen. The private clinic had little equipment, and the physician spoke of transferring him to a larger hospital. But again, the walls of bureaucracy rose. Without insurance, without official admission, the path was blocked. Lena stood at the bedside, her hands gripping the rail. She listened to the rattle in his chest, saw the monitor numbers sinking, and felt a cold fury spread through her veins. The physician shook his head gently. We have reached the point where intervention must be decided by those with authority. You are not... She cut him off, her voice firm. If I am not, then who is? He is my brother. If I am wrong, then blame me. But if I am right, and you stop me, then you let him die only because I am poor. The room was still. Elliot watched. His eyes narrowed, the Harvard professor silent with his pen poised above the pad. Lena bent over Lucas, her mind racing through everything she had studied. She remembered the articles she had read in stolen minutes, the images from faded textbooks, the diagrams drawn again and again under the kitchen light. She knew of a technique, described once in a lecture she had overheard online, for adjusting the placement of an airway tube. The risk was high, but so was doing nothing. Her hands trembled only once before she steadied them. She guided the small tube, adjusted its angle carefully, her breaths slow to match his. She whispered as she worked, "Just one more, Lucas. Stay with me. Just one more." For a terrible moment, silence pressed in. Then his chest rose. The monitor beeped. Oxygen climbed. 70, 78, 82. His eyes fluttered, then opened just enough to find hers. Relief broke her like a wave. She pressed her forehead to his, tears slipping free. "You will not die because I am poor. Not while I can still learn. Not while I still breathe." The physician exhaled deeply, stunned. The Harvard professor scribbled a note, then looked at Elliot with a gaze heavy with meaning. Elliot said nothing, only placed his hand on Lena's shoulder. It was not approval nor command. It was solidarity. Hours passed. Lucas slept, his breaths steadier. Lena sat beside him, her hand never leaving his. She knew the fight was not over, but she had won a single round, and sometimes a single round meant the difference between life and death. That night, Elliot remained long after the staff had gone. He watched the boy sleep, the girl bent in silent vigil, and he felt the stirrings of something he had not felt in decades. Not power, not control, but faith. Faith in the stubborn courage of those who had nothing, yet gave everything. And in the quiet room of a small clinic in New Mexico, a battle was marked not by applause, not by headlines, but by the steady rhythm of a child's fragile breath. The clinic was quiet at night, its walls humming with the low sound of machines and the steady rhythm of oxygen pumps. Lucas slept, his small body wrapped in a blanket, his chest rising and falling with a fragile steadiness that gave Lena hope. She sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, unwilling to let go even for a moment. The battle was not over, but for the first time in days, she felt that he had been given back to her, at least for now. Elliot Langford stood at the window, staring out at the desert night. The stars stretched across the sky, bright and cold, so far beyond reach. He seemed older in that dim light, his shoulders drawn in, his face shadowed by thought. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, roughened by something Lena had never heard before. "I have not told you the truth about myself," he said. She turned, surprised. "I am sick, Lena. Not in the way of a passing illness, but in the final way. The doctors told me months ago. Pancreatic cancer. It has already spread. I chose not to fight it." Her breath caught. She had grown used to his commanding presence, his certainty. The thought of him frail and failing seemed impossible. She whispered, "Why would you not fight?" He looked at her then, and for once his eyes carried no armor. "I have fought for everything in my life. Money, power, respect. I fought until there was nothing left worth the struggle. And then, when they told me of the cancer, I realized I had no reason to fight. Until I saw you." Lena shook her head, her throat tight. "Do you know," he continued, "that night I found you in the kitchen with your papers. It was the first time in years I felt the world still had hope. You, a maid with no training, drawing lungs on scraps of paper as if the world itself depended on it. It made me ashamed of my own surrender." She could not answer. Her tears blurred the room. "I have no children, no heirs worth the name," Elliot said. "But I have the means to leave behind more than silence. I want you to accept it." He pulled a document from his coat pocket, a folder thick with pages and marked with legal seals. "This is my final signature," he said. "The Langford Medical Foundation. It will bear the names of you and your brother. It will support children who suffer as he suffers, families who cannot pay. And it will fund your education, Lena, not only for medicine but for everything you need to carry this further." She shook her head, overwhelmed. "I cannot accept this. You must." he said firmly, because I have only months, and I will not leave this world with nothing but empty halls and forgotten parties. I want my name tied to something that breathes, something that heals. And you are the one who showed me it is possible. He placed the pen in her hand. She stared at it, trembling, then set it down. Sir, you do not need to do this for me. He smiled faintly. I am not doing it for you. I am doing it because I want to believe that when I am gone, there will still be something human left of me. You gave me that gift, Lena. Let me give this back. His hand, frail though still steady, pressed the pen against the paper. His signature flowed across the line, the ink dark and final. When it was done, he leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, as if a great weight had been lifted. Thank you, he whispered, for reminding me that people still matter. She wanted to protest again, but the words would not come. Instead, she bowed her head and whispered, Thank you, sir. That night, with Lucas sleeping peacefully and the foundation born on paper, Lena felt the strange union of sorrow and hope. She knew his time was short. She knew her brother's struggle was far from over. Yet she also knew that something larger than either of them had been set into motion, something that would live beyond both their breaths. Years later, the grand hall of Harvard Medical School was filled with the rustle of gowns and the solemn notes of a string ensemble. The air carried the scent of polished wood and paper programs. The energy of hundreds of families gathered to watch their children step into a future hard won. On the stage, names were called one by one, each answered by the sound of applause. Among the graduates stood Lena Moreno, her gown plain, her face composed, but her heart trembling. She had survived years of study, nights of exhaustion, the weight of being both student and caregiver. Lucas had grown stronger in those years, supported by the treatments the foundation had provided, by the steady care she had never ceased to give. She had sat through lectures on anatomy and physiology, and remembered nights in the kitchen when she had drawn the same lessons on butcher paper. She had dissected cadavers and thought of her brother's fragile lungs, how real and sacred the organs of life truly were. Now she walked across the stage, her name called with the title Doctor before it. The applause rose, the room bright with pride, yet her eyes sought the first row of seats, the place reserved for honored guests. There was an empty chair there, set carefully at the end of the line, left vacant in silent respect. Elliot Langford had died weeks before, his illness claiming him as quietly as a candle burning low. She accepted her diploma with steady hands, but when she stepped down, the tears came. She returned to her seat, clutching the folder as if it carried not only her degree, but his blessing. Later, at the small reception, an aide from the foundation handed her an envelope. Inside, in Elliot's careful handwriting, was a single line. Thank you for making me believe in people again. She pressed the paper to her heart. Around her, graduates laughed, families embraced, cameras flashed. Yet for her, the moment was quieter, deeper. She had reached the summit of years of struggle, but she stood there with both joy and grief. Lucas, now taller, stood beside her in a simple suit, his smile shy but proud. He whispered, He would have been proud, Hermanita. She nodded, unable to speak, her tears falling freely. The sun dipped lower outside the windows, casting the hall in warm gold. In that light, she felt his presence, not in body, but in the echo of his faith, in the foundation that bore her name and her brother's, in the countless breaths of children who would live because one man chose to believe in a maid's midnight sketches. Her diploma shone in the fading sun, but it was not the paper that mattered. It was the journey, the vow she had made in a cramped kitchen, the vow she would carry forever, that no child should be left to die simply because they were poor. The town had not changed much in the years since Lena last walked its dusty streets. The houses still leaned against the desert wind, their paint faded, their roofs patched with tin. The grocery store still smelled of dried beans and old wood. The sky was still vast, swallowing the horizon with its pale light. But on the edge of the neighborhood, where once there had been only a weed-choked lot, now stood a building painted white, its windows wide, its doors open to the street. Above the entrance, in letters dark against the sunlight, was a name: the Lucas Moreno Free Clinic. The opening day brought families from every corner of the small town, mothers with children on their hips, old men leaning on canes, young men who had worked all week in the fields. They stood in line quietly, as if waiting for something they had long ago stopped believing would ever come to them. Inside, the smell of disinfectant mixed with the warmth of fresh paint. The waiting room was modest but clean, lined with chairs donated from the foundation. On the wall hung a photograph in a simple black frame. It showed Elliot Langford standing at the bedside of a boy, his hand resting gently on the rail, his gaze fixed not on the camera, but on the child who slept. Behind the desk, Lucas, now grown into a young man, adjusted his white coat. He was only a student still, but the coat had been given to him as a promise. He wiped dust from the glass of the framed photo, his hand steady. He looked at his sister and said, "Mama once cleaned other people's floors, but her heart was the first clinic I ever knew." Lena stood in the doorway, her own coat crisp, her stethoscope warm against her neck. She smiled at him through tears. The years of struggle had carved quiet lines around her eyes, but they had also given her a presence that filled the room. She walked among the patients waiting, greeting each with the same humility she had carried when she served trays in a mansion. When she examined the first child, a boy coughing with the same brittle wheeze she remembered from her brother's bed, she knelt so that her eyes were level with his. She spoke in the same plain language she had once whispered to Lucas. "Your lungs are like a tree," she told him softly. "Right now, some of the branches are blocked. We will help clear them so the wind can pass through again." The boy nodded, trusting her instantly. All day the clinic filled with the sounds of breath, ragged, shallow, restored. Lena and Lucas moved through the rooms like steady currents, one guiding, one learning. Neighbors who had once pitied them now came for healing, and with each breath eased, the debt of the past was paid forward. In the quiet between patients, Lena stepped into her office, where a single envelope still rested in the drawer. The last words Elliot Langford had written to her were folded inside. "Thank you for making me believe in people again." She read them whenever doubt crept in, whenever exhaustion threatened. Each time the words steadied her. That evening, when the sun lowered and the clinic doors closed, she walked outside and looked at the sign again. The letters glowed faintly in the fading light. The Lucas Moreno Free Clinic. She thought of her brother asleep in their childhood room, coughing in the dark. She thought of herself sketching lungs on butcher paper under a dim bulb, afraid of discovery, yet unwilling to stop. She thought of Elliot standing in the kitchen doorway, his voice rough as he asked, "Who are you trying to save?" She whispered into the evening air, "I saved him, Elliot, and now we will save many more." The desert wind carried her words away, scattering them like seeds across the town. Somewhere a child laughed, free of cough for the first time in weeks. Somewhere an old man sighed in relief, his chest eased by medicine he had thought forever beyond reach. Somewhere, in the memory of a man who had once believed only in money, a quiet legacy lived on, written not in stone, but in the simple act of breathing. Lena placed her hand on the clinic wall, warm from the sun, and closed her eyes. She felt the weight of years, of battles fought in silence, of sorrow endured and hope born anew. She knew there would be more nights of fear, more children gasping, more hands reaching for help. But she also knew that the spark once nearly extinguished in a kitchen now burned steady, a light for others. She turned back inside, where her brother waited, where patients would return tomorrow, where the work of saving lives would never end. And as the door closed behind her, the clinic stood against the dusk, a small white flame in the desert, carrying the name of a child whose breath had once sounded like a fragile whistle in the dark, but who now laughed, studied, and dreamed. And so the story of a maid who studied lungs on scraps of paper ended not with applause or degrees alone, but with the steady rhythm of life restored, one breath at a time. This story was born from the quiet spaces where hope often hides, in kitchens after midnight, in small rented rooms filled with the sound of a child's breathing, in the hearts of those who have little yet give everything. I want to thank the readers who have walked slowly through these chapters, allowing themselves to breathe with Lena, with Lucas, with Elliot. Your patience has been the fire that kept this tale alive, warm as a hearth in winter. To the families who have lived with illness and poverty, whose nights were measured in breaths and whose days were built on courage, this book carries a piece of your struggle. It was written for you and in honor of the countless acts of love that never make it to headlines, but save lives all the same. To the teachers, doctors, and nurses who still remember that knowledge is meant to serve, not to stand above, may you see yourselves in the quiet persistence of a girl who refused to stop learning. And finally, to those who believe that even one child's breath is worth the fight, who carry hope into places that seem too poor or too forgotten, thank you. You are the reason stories like this can end not in despair, but in light.